Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of Facts and Folklore of the DuBois Fort. My name is Amber Nielsen, and I am the Arts and Interpretation Manager at Historic Huguenot Street. I hope you had a chance to watch part 1 of the series last week, but if you didn't, here's a quick recap. We talked about 3 centuries of history at the DuBois Fort on Huguenot Street, from its construction circa 1705 to its current function as the HHS Visitor Center. We talked about Louis DuBois, the New Paltz founder, and his wife, Catherine Blanchin, who was kidnapped in 1663. And we explored the many different versions of the story of how she was released from captivity, including how she possibly sang her way to freedom. We remembered Zion. We talked about how the DuBois Fort wasn't really a fort, but the gun ports are really gun ports, and somehow it took an 8.5-minute video to explain all that. But if you're in quarantine anyway, what else do you have to do? Bake your 14th banana bread? We've got some fascinating topics to cover today, so buckle in for another whirlwind of history, legends, and other shenanigans. Let's start with one of my favorite stories, the tale of the woman in brown. Now, among the many different functions of the DuBois Fort over the centuries, perhaps the most memorable for many longtime New Paltz residents was the Old Fort restaurant. Elsie Oates opened the restaurant in the late 1930s, and the business continued until 1990. Over the decades, countless people enjoyed the Old Fort's home-style dishes, and the restaurant and its grounds became a popular spot for parties, weddings, and community gatherings. It also acted as a boarding house during this time, and even Elsie lived upstairs of her restaurant. Elsie was known for engaging with her guests and sharing stories about her life, but the most popular story she loved to tell was the night she was visited by a ghostly apparition. One evening, in the early days of the restaurant, Elsie closed up shop for the night and went up to bed. At about 2 a.m., she suddenly awoke and couldn't get back to sleep. She got up to use the restroom down the hall, but right as she opened the door, an apparition appeared before her. It was a woman. The apparition was wearing a long brown dress and possessed a very small waist. She had an embroidered white collar with a dark ribbon through it. But above the collar, there was nothing else. The head was totally absent. Elsie swore it was a real person, but it was completely still, like a mannequin. Elsie seemed to be more annoyed by the woman's sudden appearance than afraid, because she just walked right through it. The woman in brown never appeared again. However, Elsie knows she never left, because ever since that encounter, she heard strange noises in the house, and just after 2 o'clock every night, she'd hear footfalls on the south end staircase. The woman in brown is a permanent guest. All haunts aside, if you're interested in more history and even some original recipes from the Old Fort restaurant, you can purchase the cookbook online at our museum shop. It's chock full of unique and delicious recipes, and I highly recommend the date nut pudding. It's addictive. Now, let's take it back to one of the oldest legends on the street, which tells of a secret tunnel buried deep in the cellar. Some say the tunnel connects to several of the other cellars on Huguenot Street, having been built as part of Governor Andros's order for the early New Paltz community to build a fortified refuge. As we discovered in the last video, the DuBois Fort was probably never actually used as the community's fort. That being said, the tale of the tunnel still persisted and morphed into something quite interesting. Some locals, especially Huguenot descendants, began to claim that the Underground Railroad network extended to New Paltz, and some of the stone houses on Huguenot Street were safe houses to hide African Americans who escaped from slavery. They believed an underground tunnel on Huguenot Street was a place where the escapees could stay safe. Now, not only do we have no evidence of any kind of underground tunnel, we also have no evidence that any of the houses on Huguenot Street were locations for the Underground Railroad. The perpetuation of this legend may have been a byproduct of the guilt felt by many descendants of the early community about their ancestors' involvement in enslaving human beings for 150 years. And I get it. This is not a part of history that anyone is proud of, but it's important to distinguish what's actually true, though difficult to swallow, from what isn't true but sounds nice. Everyone wants to be a hero, or at least know a hero in their family line. Unfortunately, as interesting as that story is, the Underground Railroad is just not a part of the history here. I personally am a bit more invested in another legend about a secret tunnel under the fort that I think might be a little more plausible. An old DuBois family legend says that there's a centuries old wine cellar down there. And since I am a DuBois descendant, true story, and we're in quarantine anyway, there's even more of a reason to check it out.
Well, here we go. Oh, wow. Let's see. Wine cellar. Whoa.
Yeah, didn't find anything really, just one or two dusty old bottles, totally empty. If there was an old wine cellar down there, they must have cleared it out ages ago. Shame. Which brings us to probably my favorite document in our Huguenot Street archives that just so happens to be tied to the history of the DuBois Fort cellar. Dated as summer of 1902, this note appears to have been written by a child with a very dark imagination. It reads, "If 13 will in silence assemble in the east cellar of the old fort, I will deliver a message for centuries buried, signed in blood, a voice from the tomb." Yeah. Well, whether or not it was actually written in blood is debatable. It looks more like red marker that faded to pink over the years. Does that make it less creepy? Absolutely not. You have all the perfect elements for a horror movie right there on the page. The number 13, people gathering, probably a cult, a centuries buried message, and a voice from the tomb, complete with a little drawing of a skull and crossbones and a machete. But, if 13 people really did gather in the cellar of the fort, that might explain the shortage of wine down there. Just saying. Thank you so much for joining me for more facts and folklore. We'd love to hear your stories, so feel free to leave them in the comments. Hope to see you back on the street at a safe distance very soon. Cheers!